In this lesson, we're going to use a flare to lead our particle trail. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull this over a bit so we can get to our project panel. And the thing that we're going to be using for this flare is going to be something that we created in graphics. So all of these things you see here, the ellipse, the glow disc, the lens flare, or actually not the lens flare, even though that has flare in the name, we'll be using this later on, and the photon star. So you can go ahead and grab those three and just drop them on top of everything that you see here. So right away, you're going to see that we kind of have just that black background. So we need to change their blending mode so that they are going to be visible through that, basically. And so what we'll be using, go ahead and toggle your switches so you can see their blending modes. The blending mode that works best for this, I've found, is screen. So turn that screen on, and now you can see through those, and that black really just goes away. Okay, so what I want to do now is start to animate these through. And I've found that the easiest way to do this is to actually use the same null object that we used to lead our flare along. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll go into that particle stream and grab that null and hit Control-C to copy it. And let's go back out to our mantra logo and just start right where we know that those particles start, and we'll hit Control-V to paste that and pull that forward. So now that null is going to follow along with those particles. It's simply a different instance of that. And we can go ahead and take all of these. Let's just have them begin just slightly before the null object does. And the reason why I want to do this is because I want them to kind of fade on before they start moving. Now, the ellipse is going to be treated a little bit differently than the glow disc and the photon star. So let's go ahead and grab the photon star and the glow disc and pull them over into position where we want them to be. So I want them to kind of just start right there on the corner of that null. And then we can just go ahead and parent them to the null itself. We don't have to worry about using the expression pick whip. So just take those, drag them down to the null, and that's going to work perfectly. Okay, so now those just kind of follow along there. And then what I want to do is just kind of, as these particles start to fade out, I want these to fade out as well. So let's go ahead and bring up their opacity with the T key. We'll go ahead and key both of those, and then just kind of come up here to where that null looks like it stops. If you need to know exactly where it stops, you can always grab the null, hit the U key, and just right there on that keyframe is where that's going to end. So we can grab both of those and we'll take them down to a 0. So it'll just kind of fade out as that continues to move up. Really, really nice. Okay, so now I want these to fade up a little bit over time. So right about here, we'll say that that's a great place for those to be at 100% opacity. So we'll just go ahead and key that in, and then we'll go back to the beginning and turn it down to 0 again. So make sure that goes all the way down to 0, and then we can just pull that, and you can kind of see how that opacity change really helps just to make that look natural. Okay, so now we've got this ellipse to kind of worry about here, and it's a very subtle shape, especially when it's put on top of this, but it really adds to the realism of that lens flare. So what I want to do is to add a little bit of rotation key and just kind of have this animate from where it is. So let's go ahead and parent this ellipse as well to our null, and we'll just see what happens. You can see how that really doesn't look very realistic. So it needs to rotate kind of in place as its position follows the null. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll move forward to the first keyframe of the null and bring up the rotation property for that ellipse. So we just hit the R key to bring that up, and we'll go ahead and key that. And let's just move forward to where this looks kind of odd. And we know that it needs to kind of rotate counterclockwise. So you can see how that is rotating it the right direction, but it's not rotating it in relation to the null, and that's because of the placement of the anchor point. So let's just go ahead and delete that rotation key really quickly and go back to the beginning. I'm going to move the anchor point to be right there on the null object's corner. So go ahead and grab your anchor point, your pan behind anchor point tool, and we'll move that anchor point into position on the null. And now you can see it still pretty much looks the same because it's following the position, but now the rotation is going to affect it much differently. So we're going to go forward here, and you can see that now whenever I move this into place, that's really going to help a lot. So now it just kind of spins in place, but really looks a lot more realistic. So let's go on to this last part here. I'm going to pull that rotation keyframe forward. We'll just rotate that back around the rest of the way. So it just kind of stays right on top of the logo there in the middle. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but we do have a slight issue that it kind of goes off just a bit. So we need to just play around with the interpolation of this, and that's not too difficult. So I'm going to kind of come to the middle here. And here at the end, we definitely know that that's going to be easy eased because our null object is. So we can go ahead and do that. Just hit F9 to ease that last keyframe, and that's already going to give you quite a bit of help. And then we'll just go ahead and kind of rotate that down a little bit like that. And let's go ahead and rove this keyframe over time. So I'm going to right click and go to keyframe, rove across time. It looks like it actually doesn't give us the option to rove the rotation over time, but I feel like this really doesn't look too strange. I'm just going to change the interpolation of this key though, instead of being an easy ease to an auto Bezier. So just hold Control and we'll click that twice. So that gives us a little bit closer to the look of what a roved across time keyframe would look like. And if you just click off of that and just watch your rain preview, you can see that it does look pretty realistic. It has a little bit of trouble whenever you actually can see the outline of that ellipse with the bounding box, but I think otherwise we have a really nice look there. And one thing that I'm noticing is that ellipse is just kind of popping on. So let's go ahead and add that same opacity change that we have for our other pieces. So I'll just grab those keys. We'll hit Control C to copy them. Then grab the ellipse and hit Control V to paste. So now that's going to fade on nicely as well. And something else that we can do is come over here to the photon star and maybe give this a little bit of rotation as well. Now it does have its anchor point in the center, which is where I want it for this. I just want it to kind of rotate around so it appears to be twinkling a bit. So we'll bring up the rotation property for that and just take that all the way to the beginning. Let's just say it rotates around, you know, about 22 degrees. Then we'll take that there to the end. So you can see it just kind of has a very subtle rotation, and really that might not even be enough. So let's crank that up a little bit more. It's going to rotate, let's say about 100 degrees or so. I think that looks better. So you really start to see the rotation over here on the corner at the end. Really nice. Okay, so now that we've changed our blending mode, we have our pieces in place, we have all of those keys. Now, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and add some reflection as well. So the way to do the reflection is to simply grab this lens flare and kind of flip it over at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is we're going to select all the pieces that create this flare, and we'll hit Control-Shift-C to pre-comp them. And we'll call this flare trail. And go ahead and say OK to that. And then let's go inside of that comp and we'll trim it to begin where those pieces begin. This looks like it begins at frame 42, so we'll remember that. Hit the B key, right click, go to Trim Comp to Work Area. And then let's go back out to our mantra logo and forward to frame 42. And we'll just pull that over here. And one of the things you notice whenever this happens is that we get this kind of strange look where we lost our blending modes, and that's just because it's been pre-composed. So to fix that, let's toggle our switches and go ahead and collapse our transformations, and that's just going to give us basically the blending modes that we started out with. Okay, so that looks much better there. And now we're ready to create our reflection. So go ahead, grab that flare trail, we'll hit Control D to duplicate it. And this part can be a little bit tricky for some people, so we can go slowly if you are having any trouble kind of figuring out exactly what this is supposed to do. And we can move it also later on. So we've got our flare trail. Let's go ahead and grab this bottom one. We'll right click it, rename, and call it flare trail reflection, just so we know which one we're talking about. And go ahead and select it. Hit the S key to bring up your scale. So what we need to do is basically flip this around. So it's kind of a mirror image of itself. So the way to do that, you could do a transform, flip horizontal, or basically what that does is it unlinks these and makes this 100 a negative 100. So when I do that, just watch what happens. It just flips that over directly like that. And so now what I want to do is flip this upside down. So go ahead, grab your rotation tool, and we'll turn this upside down. And it looks like I accidentally turned the mantra logo upside down. So we want to make sure we're turning the flare reflection upside down. Okay, so just turn that upside down like that and hold shift to snap it into place. And then we're just going to move this down just like that. Now this is probably at that point out of the reflection. So what I'm going to do is we'll just move this over here just about to the middle, and I'll keep pulling this down so that it really does look like a reflection that's going to be on the floor. And we can move it on a little more later on if we need to, but let's go ahead and add our effects to this. So we've got our camera lens blur that makes that look a little bit blurrier on the floor, and you'll notice that adding that blur makes us lose that blending mode that we were having. So you can just go back over here to your switches and change that mode to add again, and that'll fix that for you. And then we also want to change the transparency a little bit, so you can select that, hit the T key, and we'll turn that down to 25 as well. So it's just going to be a subtle reflection on the floor, just like that. So now you can see how those are following each other. And one thing that you can do, if you really want to make sure that you're doing it correctly, is that, you know, this flare would actually probably be a little bit lower here, because you can see that it's not really following along with that. So maybe move it down a bit. We know that it's going to be a little bit lower here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Really, you could choose not to have the flare if you didn't want to, just because you really only need it for a few seconds that it's actually visible, because I feel like this even could be a little bit lower, just like that. But I think it's nice to still have it since we have the reflectivity for other elements. Okay, so now that that flare's been created, we've created its reflection, we're ready to move on. And now what I want to do is to create a background. And that's basically going to be some particles just kind of floating around that have that bokeh feel to them, where they're very much kind of out of focus and just kind of just floating through the air. So there's a couple different things that we can do to really make those feel realistic. And so I'm going to teach you how to make that in the next lesson.